What happens when a king discovers that the person protecting him has been hiding a secret that could change everything? What happens when power meets humility, and, when a command given in anger transforms into something no one expected? This is not just a story about royalty and guards. This is a story about honor, sacrifice, and the moment when a king learned that true nobility has nothing to do with crowns or thrones. It is a story that begins with a single command and ends with a revelation that left an entire court speechless. Some say it changed the way people thought about their king forever. Others say it revealed something about human nature that we often forget. But everyone who witnessed that day in the Grand Hall of Buckingham Palace agrees on one thing: they had never seen anything like it before, and they never would again. The morning of November 15th started like any other morning at Buckingham Palace. The staff moved through the hallways with practiced efficiency, their footsteps soft on the ancient carpets that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Maids carried fresh linens to the guest chambers while butlers prepared the silver for the afternoon tea service. In the kitchens below, chefs had been working since before dawn, preparing for a state dinner that would host dignitaries from 12 different nations. Everything was proceeding according to schedule, just as it always did in this place where tradition ruled every moment of every day. King Charles had risen early that morning, earlier than usual. He had not slept well the night before, troubled by dreams he could not quite remember upon waking. There was something heavy in his chest, a feeling of unease that he could not explain. He attributed it to the stress of the upcoming dinner, to the weight of responsibilities that never seemed to lighten no matter how many years passed. Being king was not something one grew accustomed to, not really. The crown sat heavy on the head, and the duties sat heavier still on the heart. He stood by the window of his private chambers, looking out at the gardens below. The November morning was gray and cold, with a thin mist hanging over the perfectly manicured lawns. Gardeners were already at work, trimming hedges and raking leaves that had fallen overnight. They moved with the same quiet efficiency as everyone else in the palace, each person playing their part in the grand machinery of royal life. Charles watched them for a long moment, thinking about how different their lives must be from his own. They would go home tonight to families who loved them simply for who they were, not for what they represented. They would sit at dinner tables and laugh about the events of the day without worrying about protocol or diplomacy. In some ways, he envied them deeply. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His personal secretary, a man named William Hartley who had served in this position for nearly 20 years, entered with a leather folder containing the day's schedule. William was a tall, thin man with silver hair and spectacles that always seemed to be sliding down his nose. He had an air of perpetual worry about him, as if he was constantly anticipating disasters that might occur. This morning, that worry seemed more pronounced than usual. "Good morning, Your Majesty," William said, bowing slightly before approaching. "I hope you slept well." Charles turned from the window with a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Well enough, William. Well enough. What does the day hold for us?" William opened the folder and began reading through the schedule. There was a meeting with the Prime Minister at 10 o'clock to discuss the economic situation. At noon, Charles was expected to receive the ambassador from Japan, who was presenting his credentials. The afternoon would be consumed with preparations for the state dinner, including a final review of the seating arrangements and menu. In between all of this, there were documents to sign, letters to approve, and countless small decisions that somehow all required the king's personal attention. Charles listened to the recitation with half an ear, his mind still drifting to that unexplained feeling of unease. When William finished, he nodded and moved toward his dressing room. "Very well. Send Marcus in to help me dress. I will take breakfast in my study this morning." Marcus Webb was the king's valet, a position he had held for the past 8 years. He was a quiet man in his 50s, efficient and unobtrusive in the way that the best valets always were. He appeared moments later, having been waiting in the anteroom as he did every morning. Together, they went through the familiar ritual of preparing the king for his day. Dark suit, perfectly pressed. Tie selected with care. Shoes polished until they gleamed. Every detail attended to with precision. As Marcus worked, Charles found himself studying the man in the mirror. How little he really knew about the people who surrounded him every day. He knew that Marcus was married, that he had 2 grown children and a grandchild on the way. He knew that Marcus supported Arsenal and had a collection of antique watches that he was quite proud of. But, beyond these surface details, what did he really know? What dreams kept Marcus awake at night? What fears haunted him? What joys filled his heart? These were questions a king never thought to ask, and perhaps that was the great tragedy of royal life, the walls that separated him from genuine human connection. "Is everything all right, Your Majesty?" Marcus asked, noticing that Charles had been unusually quiet. "You seem troubled this morning." Charles managed another small smile. "Just thinking, Marcus. Just thinking. Nothing to concern yourself with." But, as he made his way down to his study for breakfast, the feeling of unease continued to grow. It was as if something was waiting for him just around the corner, something that would change the course of this day in ways he could not yet imagine. He tried to shake off the feeling as foolish superstition. He was a modern king in a modern world, and he did not believe in premonitions or omens. Yet the feeling persisted, a shadow at the edge of his consciousness that would not be ignored. The study where Charles took his breakfast was one of his favorite rooms in the palace. It was smaller and more intimate than the grand staterooms, with wood-paneled walls lined with books and a fireplace that was already crackling with a warm fire against the morning chill. A small table had been set by the window, laid with fine china and silver. His breakfast, poached eggs, toast, and a pot of strong tea, was already waiting for him. He ate slowly, reading through the morning papers that had been left beside his plate. The news was much as it always was: political disputes, economic concerns, the endless churn of events that made up modern life. There was an article about the state dinner that evening, speculating about what diplomatic matters might be discussed. Another article questioned whether the monarchy was still relevant in the 21st century, a question that seemed to be asked with increasing frequency these days. Charles set aside the papers and finished his tea. Relevance. It was a word that haunted him. He understood the argument that the monarchy was an outdated institution, a relic of a feudal past that had no place in a democratic society. He had heard these arguments all his life. And, yet, he also believed deeply in the role the monarchy could play as a symbol of continuity, as a unifying force above the petty divisions of politics, as a reminder of history and tradition in a world that sometimes seemed to be changing too fast. But, what was his role in all of this? What could he do, truly do, to make a difference? He was a constitutional monarch, bound by laws and conventions that limited his power to largely ceremonial functions. He could give speeches and host dinners and cut ribbons at openings. But, could he actually change anything? Could he touch lives in ways that mattered? These were the questions that kept him awake at night, the questions that no amount of royal privilege could answer. A clock somewhere in the palace chimed the hour, pulling him from his reverie. It was time to begin the official business of the day. He rose from the table and straightened his jacket, composing his features into the calm, dignified expression that was expected of a king. Whatever personal doubts and uncertainties he might feel, they had no place in his public role. The crown demanded composure, and composure he would give. The meeting with the Prime Minister proceeded much as these meetings always did. They sat in the king's private audience room, discussing economic policies and international relations with the careful formality that characterized their interactions. The Prime Minister was a practical woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had been in office for 3 years now. She was efficient and competent, treating the king with respect but without any particular warmth. Charles sometimes felt that she saw him more as an obligation than a genuine partner in governance, and perhaps she was right to feel that way. His role was to advise and to warn, but the actual power lay with elected officials like her. After the Prime Minister departed, Charles had a few moments to himself before the next engagement. He found himself wandering through the corridors of the palace, a habit he had developed over the years when he needed to clear his head. The guards stationed along the way snapped to attention as he passed, and he nodded to each of them with what he hoped was genuine acknowledgement. These were the men and women who protected him day and night, who stood ready to give their lives for his safety. He often wondered what they thought of him, standing there in their red uniforms with their impassive faces. One guard in particular caught his attention that morning. He was stationed at the end of the long gallery, a corridor lined with portraits of Charles's ancestors going back centuries. The guard was younger than most, perhaps in his early 30s, with a strong jaw and clear eyes that met the king's gaze for just a moment before looking straight ahead again. There was something in those eyes, a steadiness, a depth, that Charles found striking. He made a mental note to inquire about the man later, then continued on his way. The Japanese ambassador arrived precisely at noon, as expected. The credential ceremony was a formal affair, conducted in the throne room with all the pomp and circumstance that such occasions demanded. Charles sat on the throne that had been used by monarchs for generations, accepting the ambassador's letters of credence with the proper words and gestures. It was all very dignified and very tedious, but such ceremonies were an essential part of international diplomacy. They created connections between nations that went beyond mere politics. After the ceremony, there was a brief reception where Charles had the opportunity to speak with the ambassador more informally. Ambassador Tanaka was a cultured man who spoke excellent English and had a genuine appreciation for British history. They discussed art and literature, finding common ground in their admiration for certain poets and painters. It was one of the more pleasant conversations Charles had enjoyed in weeks, a reminder that there were still moments of genuine human connection even within the rigid framework of royal life. But, even as he conversed with the ambassador, part of Charles's mind remained elsewhere. That feeling of unease had not dissipated. If anything, it had grown stronger as the day progressed. He kept glancing toward the doors of the reception room, half expecting something or someone to appear. It was an absurd feeling, and he tried repeatedly to dismiss it, but it would not leave him. The afternoon brought the expected chaos of state dinner preparations. The household staff had been working for weeks to ensure that every detail was perfect, but there were always last-minute crises that required attention. A delivery of flowers had arrived wilted and needed to be replaced. One of the musicians who was supposed to perform had fallen ill and a substitute needed to be found. The seating chart, which had been agonized over for days, needed to be adjusted when one of the guests requested a change at the last minute. Charles dealt with each issue as it arose, making decisions with the calm authority that was expected of him. Inside, however, he felt anything but calm. The unease had evolved into something like anticipation, though anticipation of what he could not say. He found himself watching the clock, counting down the hours until the dinner would begin, as if something important was waiting for him at the end of that countdown. At 5 o'clock, he retired to his chambers to rest and prepare for the evening. Marcus arrived to help him dress in the formal attire that the occasion demanded, white tie and tails, medals and decorations arranged just so, every detail perfect. As Marcus worked, Charles studied himself in the mirror once again. He looked every inch the king, commanding and dignified. But, who was the man beneath the costume? Did anyone really know? Did he even know himself? Marcus, he said suddenly, surprising both himself and his valet. Have you ever had a day when you felt that something important was about to happen? When you couldn't explain it, but you just knew that everything was about to change? Marcus paused in his work, considering the question. Yes, Your Majesty, he said after a moment. I felt that way the day my first grandchild was born. I woke up that morning knowing somehow that it would be the day, even though the baby wasn't due for another week. Charles nodded slowly. And, were you right? Was it the day? It was, Your Majesty. My daughter went into labor that afternoon, and, by evening, I was holding my grandson in my arms. Marcus smiled at the memory. Sometimes we know things that we can't explain. I think it's the universe's way of preparing us for what's to come. It was a simple answer, perhaps a superstitious one, but it resonated with something deep in Charles's soul. Perhaps the universe was indeed trying to prepare him for something. The question was, what? The state dinner began at 7 o'clock sharp. The guests assembled in the state dining room, one of the grandest spaces in Buckingham Palace. The long table was set with the finest china, crystal, and silver, each place setting a work of art in itself. Candles flickered in ornate candelabras, casting a warm glow over the scene. The dignitaries had arrived in their finest attire, the women glittering with jewels, the men distinguished in their formal wear. Charles moved through the room before dinner was served, greeting each guest personally. This was one aspect of royal life that he genuinely enjoyed: the opportunity to meet people from around the world, to hear their stories and learn about their countries. He spoke with the president of a small European nation about climate change initiatives, with a cabinet minister about education reforms, with the wife of an ambassador about her charity work with refugees. Each conversation was brief but meaningful, a moment of real connection amid the formality. But, throughout these interactions, Charles remained aware of the guards standing at attention around the perimeter of the room. They were a necessary presence at events like this, where so many important people gathered in one place. Security had been a constant concern throughout his life, and he had long ago grown accustomed to being surrounded by protectors. Tonight, however, he found himself studying them more closely than usual. Were they happy, these men who spent their lives standing guard while others celebrated? Did they resent the role they played, always on the outside looking in? Or did they take pride in their service, finding meaning in their duty to protect? One guard in particular drew his attention, the same young man he had noticed earlier in the long gallery. He was stationed near the main entrance to the dining room, his posture perfect, his expression neutral. But there was something in his bearing that set him apart from the others. It was not arrogance or pride, but rather a kind of quiet dignity that Charles found compelling. He made a note to himself to learn the man's name before the evening was over. Dinner was served in the traditional manner, course after course of exquisite food prepared by the palace's acclaimed chefs. There was smoked salmon from Scotland, followed by a delicate soup, then roast beef with all the trimmings. Conversation flowed around the table, carefully managed to avoid controversial topics while still allowing for meaningful exchange. Charles played his role as host with practiced ease, guiding discussions, smoothing over awkward moments, ensuring that everyone felt welcomed and valued. But, as the main course was being cleared away, something happened that would set in motion the events that everyone would remember for years to come. One of the servers, a young man who was clearly nervous about serving at such an important event, stumbled while removing a plate. In his attempt to catch himself, he knocked over a wineglass, sending red wine splashing across the pristine white tablecloth and onto the lap of the distinguished guest seated nearby. The guest was Lord Pennington, one of the most powerful and influential members of the House of Lords. He was known for his fierce temper and his intolerance of any perceived slight. His face went red with fury as he looked down at his ruined trousers, and, before anyone could intervene, he had raised his hand and struck the young server across the face. A gasp went through the room. The server, stunned by the blow, dropped the plate he was carrying. It shattered on the floor with a crash that seemed deafening in the sudden silence. Lord Pennington rose from his seat, his face twisted with rage, his arm drawn back for another strike. What happened next would be the subject of much discussion in the days and weeks that followed. The guard by the door, the young man Charles had noticed earlier, moved with incredible speed. In an instant, he was between Lord Pennington and the server, his body a shield protecting the young man from further harm. He did not touch Lord Pennington, did not raise a hand against him, but his presence was enough to stop the nobleman in his tracks. "Sir," the guard said, his voice calm but firm. "Please take your seat." Lord Pennington's face went from red to purple. "How dare you?" he sputtered. "Do you know who I am? Stand aside this instant, you common soldier." The guard did not move. "With respect, sir, I cannot allow you to strike another person. Please return to your seat." The tension in the room was palpable. Every guest had turned to watch the confrontation, their dinners forgotten. The other guards around the perimeter remained at their posts, but Charles could see their hands moving toward their weapons, uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented situation. Lord Pennington was a peer of the realm, a man of immense influence. The guard was a common soldier, bound by duty and protocol. What would happen next? It was Charles who broke the impasse. He rose from his seat at the head of the table, and, as he did so, every person in the room turned to face him. The weight of their attention was almost physical, pressing against him like a wave. This was the moment. This was what the day had been building toward. He could feel it in his bones, that sense of destiny that he had been unable to shake all day. "Lord Pennington," Charles said, his voice carrying across the silent room. you will return to your seat immediately. And, you will apologize to the young man you struck. Lord Pennington's eyes bulged with disbelief. Your Majesty, surely you cannot be serious. This clumsy fool ruined my clothing. And, this guard had the temerity to— I am entirely serious, Charles interrupted, his tone allowing no argument. What you did was inexcusable. Violence against those who serve us is never acceptable, regardless of any offense they may have given. You will apologize. The room held its breath. Lord Pennington was a man used to getting his way, used to deferential treatment from everyone around him. To be reprimanded publicly by the king himself was an unimaginable humiliation. His face worked through a series of emotions: rage, disbelief, calculation, before finally settling into a mask of forced calm. I apologize, he muttered through clenched teeth, not looking at the server. For any distress I may have caused. It was a poor apology, insincere and grudging, but it would have to do for now. Charles nodded curtly and gestured for Lord Pennington to be seated. The nobleman sank into his chair, his shoulders hunched with resentment. The young server was quickly escorted from the room by the head butler, shaking but unharmed. The other guests began to murmur among themselves, still shocked by what they had witnessed. But Charles's attention was no longer on Lord Pennington or the server. He was looking at the guard who had intervened, who was now standing back at his post by the door as if nothing had happened. Their eyes met across the room, and, in that moment, Charles felt a shock of recognition. Not recognition of the man's face, which he still did not know, but recognition of something deeper. This man had done what no one else in the room had dared to do. He had stood up against power to protect someone vulnerable. He had risked his career, perhaps his entire future, for a stranger. Charles filed away the moment in his mind, knowing that this was not the end of the matter. Not by far. He would learn everything there was to know about this guard. He would understand what had driven him to act as he had. And, somehow, he sensed that this was only the beginning of a story that would change everything, for the guard, for himself, and, perhaps for the monarchy itself. The dinner resumed, though the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. Conversations were more muted, glances more frequent. Everyone was aware that something significant had occurred, though few understood its full implications. Lord Pennington sat in sullen silence for the remainder of the meal, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The other guests treated him with careful neutrality, neither sympathizing with his humiliation nor openly condemning his actions. Charles performed his duties as host, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept returning to that moment when the guard had stepped between Lord Pennington and the server. The risk the man had taken was enormous. Guards were expected to remain at their posts, to be invisible sentinels watching over events without participating in them. To break protocol in such a dramatic way, and against a peer of the realm no less, could have ended his career on the spot. It should have ended his career. So why had he done it? What compelled a man to throw away everything he had worked for to protect a stranger? These were the questions that burned in Charles's mind as the evening wore on, questions he was determined to answer. After dessert had been served and cleared, Charles rose to deliver the traditional toast. He spoke of friendship between nations, of the importance of cooperation in challenging times, of the bright future that awaited if all worked together. They were the words expected of him, the words that diplomacy demanded. But, as he spoke, his eyes kept drifting to the guard by the door, and he found himself thinking about a different kind of speech entirely, a speech about courage and integrity, about standing up for what was right regardless of the consequences. The dinner concluded at 11 o'clock, and the guests began to filter out into the night. Charles stood in the entrance hall, bidding farewell to each dignitary with the appropriate words and gestures. Lord Pennington departed early, his exit marked by icy courtesy that fooled no one. The other guests followed in ones and twos, expressing gratitude for the evening even as their minds clearly churned with speculation about what had occurred. When the last guest had departed and the doors had closed, Charles stood alone in the entrance hall. The guards remained at their posts, the household staff continued their work of cleaning and restoring order, but, for a moment, the king felt completely isolated. The weight of the crown pressed down on him more heavily than ever. He had taken a stand tonight, publicly humiliating one of the most powerful men in the country. There would be consequences. Lord Pennington had allies, influence, the ability to cause trouble in countless ways. Was it worth it? Had he done the right thing? He looked toward the guard station where the young man still stood. Yes, Charles decided. It had been worth it. Some things mattered more than political convenience. Some principles could not be compromised. Tonight, he had been reminded of that truth by a common soldier who had more courage than all the nobles in that room combined. Charles made his way slowly up the grand staircase to his private chambers. Tomorrow, he would begin his investigation. Tomorrow, he would learn everything about this guard who had risked everything to do what was right. Tomorrow, the next chapter of this story would begin. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Charles went to bed with a sense of peace. Something had shifted in the universe tonight. Something important had begun. And, whatever happened next, he knew in his heart that it would change him forever. In his room, before sleep claimed him, Charles stood once more at the window, looking out at the palace grounds. The mist had lifted, and the moon cast silver light across the gardens. Somewhere out there, the guard who had acted with such courage was ending his shift, returning to whatever life awaited him beyond these walls. What was his story? What had made him the man he was? Tomorrow, Charles would find out. And, that knowledge, he sensed, would set in motion a chain of events that neither of them could have predicted. For now, the king closed his eyes and let sleep carry him away, dreaming of possibilities he had never before imagined. The morning after the state dinner brought a flurry of activity to Buckingham Palace. Word of what had happened had spread overnight, carried by servants' whispers and guests' phone calls. By breakfast time, the tabloids were already running stories about the dramatic confrontation at the royal dinner. Most of the coverage focused on Lord Pennington's behavior and the king's unprecedented public reprimand. Few mentioned the guard who had actually triggered the confrontation by stepping in to protect the server. Charles read through the coverage with mixed feelings. On one hand, he was gratified that most of the commentary seemed to support his actions. The British public, it turned out, had little sympathy for aristocrats who struck servants. Social media was full of praise for the king's stance, with many people calling it a refreshing reminder that the monarchy still stood for decency and justice. On the other hand, Charles was disturbed by how quickly the guard's role had been forgotten. The coverage made it seem as if the king had spontaneously decided to intervene, ignoring the fact that it was the guard's actions that had made the intervention possible. Without that young man stepping between Lord Pennington and the server, the entire incident might have played out differently. The server might have been struck again. The moment might have passed without any justice at all. This would not do. If there was one thing Charles was determined to accomplish today, it was to learn the identity of that guard and ensure that he received the recognition he deserved. He summoned William Hartley to his study immediately after breakfast. "William, I need information about one of the guards on duty last night at the state dinner." He was stationed by the main entrance to the dining room. Young man, 30s I would guess, strong jaw, clear eyes. He was the one who intervened with Lord Pennington. William nodded, his expression troubled. "That would be Sergeant Thomas Bradley, Your Majesty. I've already received several communications regarding him this morning." "What sort of communications?" William hesitated before answering. "Lord Pennington has filed a formal complaint. He's demanding that Sergeant Bradley be disciplined for his conduct. He's called it insubordination and assault, though of course there was no actual physical contact. He's threatening to make the matter public if his demands are not met." Charles felt his jaw tighten. So Lord Pennington was going on the offensive, trying to punish the man who had stood up to him. It was exactly the sort of petty vindictiveness he should have expected. Men like Pennington did not accept humiliation quietly. They struck back at those they perceived as responsible, especially when those people were below them in social standing. "What is Sergeant Bradley's status at the moment?" Charles asked. "He has been temporarily suspended from duty pending investigation, as per standard protocol when a formal complaint is filed against a member of the Royal Guard." "I see." Charles's voice was dangerously quiet. "And who ordered this suspension?" "The commander of the Royal Guard, sir. Colonel Harrison." He felt it was necessary to follow procedure, given the sensitivity of the situation. Charles understood the logic, even as he disagreed with it. Colonel Harrison was a by-the-book officer who believed in following rules above all else. In his mind, a complaint from a peer of the realm had to be taken seriously, regardless of the circumstances. But there was a difference between following procedure and allowing injustice to be done, and Charles was not prepared to stand by while a good man suffered for doing the right thing. "I want a complete file on Sergeant Bradley on my desk within the hour," Charles said. "His service record, his background, everything. And I want to meet with Colonel Harrison this afternoon to discuss the matter personally." William made a note. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Is there anything else?" "Yes. Find out where Sergeant Bradley is currently. I want to know that he's being treated properly during this suspension. And make sure he knows that his actions last night did not go unnoticed by the Crown." After William departed, Charles sat alone in his study, thinking. What he was about to do went against years of established protocol. Kings did not typically involve themselves in personnel matters regarding guards. There were chains of command, procedures, bureaucracies designed to handle such things. By taking a personal interest in Sergeant Bradley's case, Charles was inserting himself into a situation that many would argue was not his concern. But it was his concern. The state dinner had been his event. The intervention had occurred in his presence. And the principle at stake, that good men should not be punished for doing good deeds, was something he believed in deeply. If he was going to be king, then let him be a king who stood for something. Let him be a king who defended those who showed courage and integrity, regardless of their station in life. The file on Sergeant Thomas Bradley arrived 45 minutes later, and Charles read through it with growing fascination. The man's story was remarkable, far more so than he had expected. Thomas Bradley had been born in a small village in Yorkshire, the son of a factory worker and a school teacher. His childhood had been modest but happy, filled with books and sports and the simple pleasures of rural life. He had excelled in school, earning a scholarship to university where he studied history and politics. By all accounts, he had been destined for a career in academia or perhaps law. But then, everything had changed. When Thomas was 22, his younger brother had been diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. The treatment was expensive, far beyond what the family could afford. Thomas had dropped out of university and taken the first job that offered a good salary, the military. He had served with distinction in several overseas postings, earning commendations for bravery and leadership. His superiors described him as intelligent, principled, and fearless in the face of danger. After 10 years of active service, he had applied for a position in the Royal Guard, seen as one of the most prestigious assignments available to a soldier of his rank. What struck Charles most deeply was what the file revealed about Thomas's brother. Despite the years of treatment that Thomas's military salary had helped pay for, the young man had eventually succumbed to his illness. He had died 3 years ago, at the age of 28. Thomas had been at his bedside when the end came, having requested emergency leave to be there. Charles set down the file and stared out the window for a long moment. Here was a man who had sacrificed his own dreams to save someone he loved. A man who had faced tragedy with courage and continued to serve with honor. A man who, when he saw someone vulnerable being harmed, did not hesitate to act, because that was simply who he was. Such men were rare. Such men were precious. And Charles would be damned if he let Lord Pennington's wounded pride destroy someone like that. The meeting with Colonel Harrison took place at 3 o'clock. The colonel was a career military man, tall and ramrod straight with a bristling mustache and eyes that had seen much over the years. He stood at attention when Charles entered the room, relaxing only when the king gestured for him to be at ease. "Colonel Harrison, I understand that Sergeant Bradley has been suspended pending investigation." "That is correct, Your Majesty. Standard procedure when a formal complaint is filed." "Tell me, Colonel. In your professional opinion, did Sergeant Bradley do anything wrong last night?" Harrison hesitated. "He broke protocol, Your Majesty. Guards are expected to remain at their posts and respond only to direct threats to royal security. What Sergeant Bradley did was unprecedented. That is not what I asked. I asked if he did anything wrong. A long pause. Then, quietly, no, Your Majesty. In my opinion, Sergeant Bradley did what any decent man would do. He protected someone who was being harmed. The fact that the attacker was a peer of the realm does not change that. Charles nodded slowly. Then, why was he suspended? Because a formal complaint was filed, and procedure requires procedure, Charles interrupted, is meant to serve justice, not to obstruct it. Tell me, Colonel, if this complaint came from an ordinary citizen rather than a lord, would you take it seriously? Harrison's expression was pained. No, Your Majesty. Frankly, I would not. The circumstances make it clear that Sergeant Bradley acted appropriately. Then, why are we allowing Lord Pennington's title to change the equation? Are we saying that nobility has the right to strike servants with impunity? That those who defend the vulnerable against the powerful should be punished? No, Your Majesty. Of course not. Good. Then, this is what will happen. Sergeant Bradley's suspension will be lifted immediately. The complaint filed against him will be dismissed as without merit. And, I want him back on duty at the palace by tomorrow morning. Colonel Harrison's face showed relief. Yes, Your Majesty. I will see to it personally. One more thing, Colonel. I want to meet Sergeant Bradley myself. Tomorrow, in my private study. I believe there is much I could learn from a man like him. After Harrison departed, Charles allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. It was a minor victory in the grand scheme of things, one man's career saved from an unjust fate. But, it felt important nonetheless. It felt like a step in the right direction. That evening, as Charles prepared for bed, he found himself thinking about what tomorrow's meeting with Sergeant Bradley might bring. He had so many questions he wanted to ask. About the man's life, his choices, his philosophy. About what had driven him to act as he had. About what it meant to serve, truly serve, rather than simply follow orders. But underlying all these questions was a deeper curiosity. Charles had spent his entire life surrounded by people who treated him with deference, who told him what they thought he wanted to hear, who saw him as the crown rather than the man. Sergeant Bradley was different. He was a man who had demonstrated that he would stand for what was right regardless of consequences. Such a man might be capable of the one thing Charles rarely encountered, honesty. Tomorrow, the king would meet the guard. And, whatever happened in that meeting, Charles sensed that it would be the beginning of something extraordinary. Something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, service, and the true meaning of nobility. The palace settled into its nighttime quiet, guards taking their posts, servants retiring to their quarters. Outside, the November wind whispered through the gardens, carrying the promise of winter to come. And, somewhere in London, a suspended soldier named Thomas Bradley received word that his suspension had been lifted, that he was to return to duty, and that the king himself had requested to meet with him. Thomas read the message 3 times, unable to quite believe what he was seeing. A meeting with the king. What could that possibly mean? Was he in even more trouble than he had thought? Or was something else going on, something he could not yet understand? He would find out tomorrow. Until then, all he could do was wait, wonder, and prepare himself for whatever was to come. Like the king, Thomas had a sense that his life was about to change in ways he could not predict. Unlike the king, he had no idea why. 2 men, from vastly different worlds, each lying awake that night, each thinking about the other, each sensing that they stood on the threshold of something momentous. The story that had begun at the state dinner was only getting started. And, the revelations to come would indeed stun the entire court, just not in the way anyone expected. The morning of Thomas Bradley's meeting with the king dawned grey and cold, much like the morning 2 days before when all of this had begun. Thomas had barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. He had ironed his dress uniform 3 times, checking and rechecking every button, every crease, every medal. This was not like reporting to his commanding officer. This was an audience with the King of England. One did not get many such opportunities in life, and Thomas was determined to make the right impression, though he still had no clear idea what the right impression might be. He arrived at Buckingham Palace 2 hours before his scheduled appointment, not because he needed the extra time but because he could not bear to wait at home any longer. The familiar routine of passing through security, of showing his credentials, of walking the corridors he had walked countless times before somehow felt different this morning. Every surface seemed sharper, every sound more distinct. He was acutely aware of his surroundings in a way he had not been since his first days on the job, when everything about the palace had felt strange and overwhelming. The waiting room outside the king's private study was smaller than Thomas had expected, furnished with antique chairs and a low table covered with magazines about horses and architecture. A secretary sat at a desk by the door, typing efficiently and ignoring Thomas almost entirely. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, trying to project a calm he did not feel. The minutes crawled by like hours. At precisely 10 o'clock, the door to the study opened and the secretary looked up. "His Majesty will see you now, Sergeant Bradley." Thomas rose, took a deep breath, and walked into the king's private study. The room was not what he had imagined. He had expected grandeur, formality, the trappings of royal power on full display. Instead, he found himself in what felt almost like a comfortable den. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines worn with use. A fire crackled in the hearth, taking the chill off the November morning. Comfortable armchairs were arranged near the windows, and on a small table between them sat a tea service with 2 cups, as if the king had been expecting not a subject to receive but a friend to welcome. King Charles stood by the window, looking out at the gardens below, but he turned as Thomas entered. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Thomas stood at attention, waiting for permission to be at ease, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain the king must hear it. "Sergeant Bradley," the king said finally, his voice warm but measured. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit down." Thomas hesitated. "Your Majesty, please." The king gestured to one of the armchairs. "This is not a formal audience. I asked you here because I wish to speak with you, not to intimidate you. Make yourself comfortable." Slowly, feeling as though he was breaking some unspoken rule with every step, Thomas moved to the chair and sat. The king took the chair opposite him, pouring tea for both of them without waiting for servants. It was such a human gesture, so far removed from the ceremony Thomas had expected, that he felt some of his anxiety begin to fade. "Do you know why I asked to see you?" the king inquired, handing Thomas a cup. "I assume it has something to do with what happened at the state dinner, Your Majesty." "Indeed it does. But perhaps not in the way you think." The king settled back in his chair, studying Thomas with an intensity that was not uncomfortable but certainly penetrating. "I have read your service record, Sergeant Bradley. It makes for impressive reading. Multiple commendations for bravery. Exemplary performance reviews. The respect of your fellow soldiers and your commanding officers alike. You are, by all accounts, an exceptional man." Thomas felt his face warm. "I have simply tried to do my duty, Your Majesty." "Ah, duty. That is an interesting word, is it not? So often invoked, so rarely examined." The king sipped his tea thoughtfully. "Tell me, Sergeant Bradley, what do you understand duty to mean?" The question caught Thomas off guard. He had expected to be interrogated about his actions at the dinner, perhaps warned about the importance of protocol, given a formal reprimand or an equally formal commendation. He had not expected philosophy. But something about the king's manner, the genuine curiosity in his eyes, made Thomas want to answer honestly rather than with the safe platitudes he might have offered to anyone else. "Duty is doing what needs to be done, Your Majesty," he said slowly, working through his thoughts as he spoke. "Not what is easy, not what is expected, but what is right. Especially when it comes at a cost. And, at the dinner, when you stepped between Lord Pennington and that young server. You knew there would be a cost. I knew there might be, yes. Yet you did it anyway. Why?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, remembering the crash of the falling plate. The fury on Lord Pennington's face. The fear in the young server's eyes. The moment of decision that had felt like no decision at all. Because I could not stand there and watch someone be hurt, he said finally. Not when I had the power to stop it. What sort of man would I be if I let that happen? What sort of guard? The king nodded slowly, as if Thomas had confirmed something he had suspected. Many men would have stood by. Many men did stand by. The room was full of guards, full of dignitaries, full of people with far more power and influence than you. Yet you were the only one who moved. I cannot speak for others, Your Majesty. I can only speak for myself. That is precisely what interests me. The king set down his teacup and leaned forward slightly. Sergeant Bradley, Thomas, if I may, I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear. Advisors who calculate every word for political advantage. Courtiers who agree with everything I say out of habit or fear or simple self-interest. Genuine honesty is rarer than you might imagine at this level. Thomas was not sure how to respond to this, so he simply listened. What I saw at the dinner, the king continued, was something I have rarely seen in my years on the throne. Moral courage. The willingness to do what is right regardless of consequences. It reminded me of something I had almost forgotten, that true nobility has nothing to do with titles or bloodlines. It is a quality of character, not birth. That is generous of you to say, Your Majesty. It is honest. Nothing more. The king paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. I called you here for a reason, Thomas. Not just to thank you, though I do thank you. Your actions that night protected a young man from further harm and reminded everyone present that some principles are more important than protocol. But there is something else I wish to discuss with you. He rose and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where servants moved about their duties, unaware that they were being observed. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality, more thoughtful, perhaps more vulnerable. I have been king for several years now, and, before that, I was heir to the throne for most of my life. In all that time, I have struggled with a question that may seem strange coming from someone in my position. I have wondered whether I am truly making a difference. Whether the monarchy, this institution I represent, serves any real purpose beyond ceremony and tradition. Whether I, as an individual, can do anything that genuinely matters. Thomas listened with growing surprise. This was not the kind of thing he had ever expected to hear from a king. It was the kind of thing he might have heard from a friend struggling with doubt, questioning the direction of his life. The intimacy of the confession was disorienting, but also strangely moving. Your Majesty, he said carefully, I believe everyone struggles with such questions, regardless of their station in life. The important thing is not to have all the answers but to keep searching for them. The king turned back from the window with a slight smile. Well said. And I believe that is exactly why I need someone like you in my life, Thomas. Someone who will speak to me as a man, not as a king. Someone who will tell me the truth even when it is uncomfortable. Someone who has demonstrated that he values principle over position. I am not sure I understand, Your Majesty. I am asking you to become part of my personal protection detail. More than that, I am asking you to be someone I can talk to. Someone who can offer perspective from outside the bubble of royal life. It is an unusual request, I know, and you would be well within your rights to refuse. Your career would not suffer for it. But I wanted to make the offer personally and honestly. Thomas sat in stunned silence for a long moment. The offer was far beyond anything he could have imagined. Personal protection detail for the king was one of the most prestigious assignments in the entire guard. It meant constant proximity to the monarch, access to the inner workings of royal life, a level of trust that few ever achieved. And the king was offering it not because Thomas had followed orders but because he had broken them, because he had shown courage and integrity when it would have been easier to do nothing. Your Majesty, Thomas began, then stopped. He started again. I am honored beyond words. But, I must ask, is this not a political risk for you? Lord Pennington has many allies. By elevating me, you would be seen as taking his side in the dispute. It might cause difficulties. The king's smile grew broader. You see? This is exactly why I need you. You think not of yourself but of the consequences. You offer me honest counsel even before you have accepted the position. He returned to his chair and sat down again, his expression turning more serious. Yes, there will be political difficulties. Lord Pennington is already making trouble, calling in favors, attempting to turn others against me. But I have spent too much of my reign trying to avoid making waves. It is time I stood for something, even if standing has a cost. And you wish me to stand with you. I wish you to stand for what is right. As you did at the dinner. As I believe you have always done. The king extended his hand. What do you say, Thomas? Will you accept? Thomas looked at the outstretched hand, the hand of the King of England, offered not as a superior to a subordinate but as one man to another. In that moment, he thought of his brother, who had always encouraged him to take chances, to reach for more than seemed possible. He thought of the young server whose face had shown such fear, and such relief when Thomas had stepped in to protect him. He thought of all the times in his life when he had wondered whether his choices had truly mattered. He reached out and clasped the king's hand firmly. I accept, Your Majesty. Whatever may come, I accept. The king's face broke into a genuine smile, the first truly unreserved expression Thomas had seen from him. Good. I am glad. We have much work ahead of us, you and I. But, for now, let us finish our tea and talk like old friends. Tell me about yourself, Thomas. Tell me your story. And so Thomas did. He spoke of his childhood in Yorkshire, of his parents who had taught him the value of hard work and honesty. He spoke of his brother, his brilliant, funny, infuriating brother, and of the illness that had changed everything. He spoke of his decision to join the military, of the years of service that had shaped him, of the losses and victories that had made him who he was. He spoke with an openness he had not allowed himself in years, drawn out by the king's genuine interest and the unexpected safety of this conversation. The king listened intently, asking questions, offering observations, sharing stories of his own in return. They spoke of books they had read and places they had seen. They debated politics and philosophy, finding points of agreement and respectful disagreement. They laughed at absurdities and fell silent at moments of shared understanding. The morning passed into afternoon, and still they talked, the tea growing cold and unheated on the table between them. At some point, Thomas realized that he had stopped thinking of the man across from him as the king. He had begun to think of him simply as Charles, a man struggling with the same questions of meaning and purpose that haunted every thoughtful person, a man isolated by his position who hungered for genuine connection. The crown that sat so heavily on his head was not a blessing but a burden, and Thomas found himself feeling something unexpected, sympathy. May I ask you something, Your Majesty? Thomas said during a lull in the conversation. Of course. And, please, when we are alone like this, call me Charles. The title grows tiresome after a while. Thomas nodded, adjusting to this new informality. Charles, then. What was it about what I did at the dinner that struck you so deeply? Many people would have seen it as a minor incident, a brief disruption. But, you seem to have been affected by it in a way I do not entirely understand. The King Charles was silent for a long moment, his gaze turning inward. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, more reflective. I suppose it reminded me of something I had forgotten. Or perhaps something I had never truly understood. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I have lived my entire life in a world where actions are calculated, where everything is done for effect. Every gesture, every word, every decision must be weighed against its political implications. One learns very quickly not to act on impulse, not to trust one's instincts, not to do anything simply because it feels right. That sounds exhausting. It is. More than I can easily express. Charles ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so human and unroyal that Thomas felt a pang of recognition. When I saw you step forward, not because you had calculated the odds, not because you were following orders, but simply because someone needed help, it was like watching something from another world. A world I had almost convinced myself no longer existed. But it does exist. Such moments happen every day, all over the world. I am sure they do. But they do not happen in my world. Not often. The people around me are too cautious, too aware of consequences, too bound by protocol. No one acts on pure moral instinct anymore. Except, apparently, you. Thomas considered this. I think you underestimate the people around you. I think many of them would act, if given the chance. But they have been trained, as you say, to calculate. They have been taught that their role is to observe, not to intervene. Perhaps what they need is someone to show them that another way is possible. And, you believe I could be that someone? I believe you already are. By standing up to Lord Pennington, by refusing to let him escape consequences for his actions, you showed everyone at that dinner that rank does not exempt one from basic decency. By bringing me here today, by offering me this position, you are showing that courage will be rewarded rather than punished. These are not small things. Charles was quiet again, but this time his silence seemed thoughtful rather than troubled. You know, he said finally, I asked you here hoping that you might offer me a fresh perspective. I did not expect to receive a lesson in my own potential. I apologize if I have spoken out of turn. Not at all. You have spoken exactly as I hoped you would, honestly, and without fear. Charles rose and walked to the window once more. We live in strange times, Thomas. The world is changing faster than any of us can quite comprehend. Old institutions are being questioned, old certainties are falling away. I have often wondered whether the monarchy can survive in such a world, whether it even should survive. And, now I wonder whether the question itself is wrong. Perhaps the issue is not whether the monarchy will survive but what it will become. What it can become, if those of us who carry its banner are willing to adapt, to grow, to stand for something more than tradition alone. He turned back to face Thomas. I want to be a king who makes a difference. Not through power, I have very little of that, in the political sense, but through example. Through action. Through standing for principles that matter. Then, do it. You are the king. Who can stop you? Charles laughed, though there was little humor in the sound. You would be surprised. There are forces in this world, political forces, social forces, institutional forces, that resist change with all their might. Even a king must navigate these currents carefully or risk being swept away. But, you are willing to try. Yes. With the help of people like you, I am willing to try. The afternoon light was beginning to fade by the time their conversation wound to a close. Thomas could scarcely believe how many hours had passed, how much ground they had covered. He had arrived at the palace that morning as a soldier summoned to an audience with his sovereign. He was leaving as something entirely different, a confidant, perhaps even a friend, to a man he was only beginning to understand. Before Thomas departed, the king pressed something into his hand. It was a small pin, shaped like a crown with a single ruby at its center. This belonged to my father, Charles said. He gave it to me when I came of age, and told me to give it someday to someone I trusted completely. I want you to have it. Thomas stared at the pin, then, at the king. Your Majesty, Charles, I cannot accept something so precious. You can, and you will. Consider it a symbol of what we have begun here today. A reminder that you are not just a guard to me, but a partner in whatever comes next. Thomas closed his fingers around the pin, feeling its weight, its significance. I will treasure it always. And I will try to be worthy of the trust it represents. You already are. That is why I gave it to you. They shook hands once more at the door, and Thomas turned to make his way through the palace corridors. His mind was spinning with everything that had occurred, everything that had been said, everything that had changed. He had walked into this meeting as a sergeant facing potential disgrace. He was walking out as a member of the king's personal detail, a confidant to the crown, a participant in something that felt far larger than himself. As he passed through the entrance hall, he noticed the other guards watching him with curiosity. Word had spread quickly that the king had spent the entire day with him, that their meeting had gone far beyond the formal audience everyone expected. There would be questions later, speculation, perhaps even jealousy. Thomas would have to navigate these currents carefully. But, for now, all he could think about was the conversation he had just had. The king's vulnerability, his hopes, his fears, his determination to make a difference. The unexpected connection that had formed between two men from vastly different worlds. The sense that something important had begun, something that would unfold over the weeks and months to come in ways neither of them could fully predict. Outside, the November evening was cold and clear, the stars just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Thomas stood for a moment on the palace steps, breathing in the sharp air, feeling it fill his lungs and clear his head. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new questions. But, tonight, he allowed himself to simply feel grateful for the opportunity he had been given, for the trust that had been placed in him, for the chance to serve in a way that truly mattered. He thought of his brother, as he often did at moments like this. What would Michael say if he could see him now? He would probably laugh, make some irreverent joke about Thomas hobnobbing with royalty. But, beneath the laughter, Thomas knew, there would be pride. Michael had always believed that Thomas was destined for something more than ordinary life. Perhaps he had been right. "Watch over me, brother," Thomas murmured to the stars. "I am going to need all the help I can get." Then, he straightened his shoulders, tucked the king's pin safely into his pocket, and walked out into the night. Back in his private chambers, King Charles sat alone by the fire, thinking over the events of the day. It had been years since he had talked so freely with anyone, since he had allowed himself to be so open, so honest, so human. The experience had left him feeling drained but strangely energized, as if a weight he had not even recognized had been lifted from his shoulders. There would be consequences, of course. There were always consequences. Lord Pennington was already making trouble, and the elevation of the guard who had defied him would only fuel his resentment. Other members of the court would question the king's judgment, would whisper about favorites and improprieties, would look for ways to undermine what Charles was trying to build. He had no illusions about the road ahead. But, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Charles felt ready to face those challenges. He had found an ally in an unexpected place, someone who saw him not as a symbol but as a person, someone who was not afraid to speak truth to power. Such people were rare and precious, and Charles intended to hold on to this one. Tomorrow, he would announce the changes to his personal protection detail. Tomorrow, the political maneuvering would begin in earnest. Tomorrow, the court would buzz with gossip and speculation about what this all meant. But, tonight, Charles allowed himself a rare moment of optimism. Something had changed. Something had shifted. And, for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving forward rather than simply standing still. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the guards changed shifts with military precision, maintaining their eternal vigil over the palace. And, somewhere in the city, a man named Thomas Bradley was beginning to understand that his life would never be the same again. The story that had begun at the state dinner was just getting started. The confrontation with Lord Pennington, the suspension, the meeting with the king, these were only the opening chapters of something much larger, something that would eventually stun the entire court. But, none of them knew that yet. They were still in the beginning, still discovering each other, still learning what they might be capable of together. It would take time for the full picture to emerge. It would take patience, and courage, and more than a little luck. But, the foundation had been laid. The connection had been made. And, whatever came next, neither Charles nor Thomas would have to face it alone. That was perhaps the most important thing of all. In a world where kings and commoners, soldiers and sovereigns were expected to maintain their separate spheres, two men had found something unexpected across the divide. Not just friendship, though friendship was certainly part of it. Something more like recognition, the sense of seeing in another person the qualities one valued most in oneself. It was a beginning. Only a beginning. But, as the night deepened and the palace settled into silence, that beginning held more promise than anyone could have imagined. The days that followed Thomas Bradley's elevation to the king's personal protection detail were filled with adjustments and challenges. Thomas had to learn new protocols, new faces, new rhythms of life. The inner workings of the palace were far more complex than he had realized from his previous position, with layers of hierarchy and tradition that seemed almost Byzantine in their intricacy. There were right ways and wrong ways to do everything, and learning the difference was like mastering a new language. His fellow guards regarded him with a mixture of curiosity, respect, and barely concealed envy. It was not every day that one of their number was elevated so dramatically, and the circumstances surrounding Thomas's promotion only added to the intrigue. Everyone knew about the confrontation at the state dinner. Everyone knew about Lord Pennington's fury and the king's intervention. What they did not know, what Thomas took care to keep private, was the true nature of his relationship with the king. In public, they maintained proper distance and formality. Thomas stood guard as he always had, silent and watchful, giving no indication that anything had changed. Charles conducted his official duties with the same dignity and composure as always, treating Thomas no differently than any other member of his staff. They were careful, both of them, to give the gossips nothing to feed on. But, in private, when duties were done and the palace grew quiet, they would sometimes find time to talk. These conversations happened irregularly, fitting into the gaps between meetings and events and the countless demands on a king's time. They might be interrupted at any moment, cut short by urgent business or unexpected visitors. Yet they continued, each one building on what had come before, deepening the understanding between two very different men. Thomas found himself seeing Charles with new eyes. The public image of the king, stiff, formal, somewhat remote, bore little resemblance to the man who emerged in these private moments. The real Charles was thoughtful and funny, passionate about causes he cared for, troubled by doubts he could share with almost no one. He read voraciously, not just the briefings and reports his position required, but philosophy and history and poetry. He worried about climate change and economic inequality and the growing divisions in society. He wondered what legacy he would leave, what difference he could make, whether any of it really mattered. "Do you know what the hardest part is?" Charles said one evening, as they sat in his study with cups of tea going cold between them. "It is not the ceremonies or the schedules or even the politics. It is the isolation. Knowing that almost everyone I interact with wants something from me. A favor, a connection, access, influence. It is rare to find someone who simply wants me." Thomas nodded slowly. "I cannot imagine living that way. To never know if someone's kindness is genuine or calculated. One becomes accustomed to it, in a way. But it takes a toll. I think that is why my reaction to your actions at the dinner was so strong. You gained nothing by intervening. In fact, you risked a great deal. It was the purest example of disinterested courage I had witnessed in years." "I do not think of it that way. I simply did what seemed right. Which is exactly why it affected me so deeply. You did not stop to calculate. You simply acted, according to your principles, regardless of consequences." Charles shook his head slowly. "Do you know how long it has been since I was able to do anything without calculating the consequences? Even this conversation, even my friendship with you, is something I must be careful about. The wrong word, the wrong gesture, and it becomes ammunition for those who wish to undermine me." "Is that why you wanted me close? Because I have nothing to gain from you?" Charles considered the question. "Partly, yes. But also because I believe you can help me become a better king. Your perspective, your honesty, your willingness to challenge me, these are things I desperately need and rarely receive. Most people around me are too focused on what the king wants to remember what the man needs." This struck Thomas as profoundly sad, and he said so. Charles nodded in acknowledgement. "It is the price of the crown. I understood that when I accepted it. But understanding a price and paying it are different things." He fell silent for a moment, then looked up with a slight smile. "That is quite enough self-pity for one evening. Tell me something about yourself, Thomas. Something I do not already know." And so their conversations continued, weaving back and forth between the personal and the philosophical, the serious and the light. Thomas learned about Charles's childhood, the pressures and privileges that had shaped him, the complicated relationship with his parents and siblings, the weight of expectations that had been placed on him from birth. Charles learned about Thomas's life before the palace, the small joys and large sorrows that had made him who he was, the values his parents had instilled, the brother he had loved and lost. Through it all, the bond between them deepened. It was not a conventional friendship, the gulf between their stations made true equality impossible. But it was something real and valuable nonetheless, a connection forged in mutual respect and growing trust. Thomas found himself looking forward to these conversations more than anything else in his day. Charles, for his part, seemed to come alive in these moments in a way he rarely did during his official duties. Meanwhile, the political situation was growing more complicated. Lord Pennington had not accepted his humiliation quietly. He had spent the weeks since the dinner cultivating allies, spreading whispers, building a coalition of those who resented the king's actions. The specific complaints varied, some focused on the indignity of a peer being publicly reprimanded, others on the unprecedented elevation of a common guard, still others on vaguer concerns about the king's judgment. But they all pointed in the same direction, opposition to Charles and everything he was trying to accomplish. Thomas became aware of these currents through the subtle channels that operated in the palace. Servants gossiped. Guards exchanged looks and half-finished sentences. The atmosphere in certain rooms grew tense when particular people entered. He reported what he observed to Charles, who received the information with resignation rather than surprise. Pennington was always going to cause trouble, Charles said. His pride was wounded, and men like him do not forget such wounds easily. The question is how much damage he can actually do. Is there anything that can be done to neutralize him? Politically, perhaps. He has vulnerabilities, secrets he would prefer remained hidden. But I am not willing to sink to that level. If I use his tactics against him, what have I gained except to become more like him? Charles shook his head firmly. No, I must respond to this challenge in a way that is consistent with my principles. Even if that makes the battle harder. Thomas respected this stance, even as he worried about its practical implications. Principled men were often destroyed by those willing to fight without principles. But he also understood that Charles's position gave him some protection. It was not easy to directly attack the king, even for a powerful lord. The opposition would have to work through influence and insinuation, trying to erode support rather than confront directly. That gave Charles time to build his own alliances, to demonstrate through action that his approach could succeed. And so the chess game continued, move and countermove, while the world watched and waited to see who would prevail. Thomas found himself drawn deeper into this world of political maneuvering than he had ever imagined possible. His role had evolved beyond physical protection to something more like strategic counsel. He was becoming, in his own small way, a player in the game. It was a strange position for a soldier to find himself in, but Thomas adapted. He had always been good at understanding situations, at reading people and circumstances, at finding paths through difficulty. These skills, honed through years of military service, proved equally valuable in the tangled politics of the court. He began to offer suggestions, observations, analysis that Charles valued and often acted upon. Their partnership was becoming something more, a collaboration aimed at nothing less than reshaping what the monarchy could be. None of this happened quickly or easily. There were setbacks and frustrations, moments when the obstacles seemed insurmountable and the goal impossibly distant. There were nights when Thomas lay awake wondering what he had gotten himself into, whether he was truly helping or just making things worse. There were days when Charles seemed crushed by the weight of it all, when his usual composure cracked to reveal the exhaustion beneath. But they persevered. Step by step, day by day, they moved forward. The state dinner had lit a spark, and that spark was slowly becoming a flame. What it would ultimately illuminate remained to be seen. As autumn gave way to winter, the palace prepared for the holidays with its usual elaborate rituals. Decorations appeared in halls and chambers, traditional ceremonies were observed, the rhythm of royal life continued its ancient patterns. But, beneath the familiar surface, everything was changing. The king was changing. And, with him, perhaps, the very nature of what it meant to be a monarch in the modern world. Thomas Bradley stood in his usual place by the door, watching over the king he had come to know so well. In his pocket, he carried the ruby crown pin that Charles had given him, a reminder of the trust that had been placed in him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever trials awaited, he knew he would face them with the same determination that had brought him to this moment. The guard who had stepped forward to protect a stranger had become something more. And, the story that had begun with a shattered plate and a noble's fury was still being written, its ultimate conclusion known to no one. But, both men sensed, in their own ways, that they were building towards something. A confrontation, a revelation, a moment that would change everything. It was coming, drawing closer with each passing day. And, when it arrived, neither the court nor the country would ever be the same. The Christmas season at Buckingham Palace was unlike anything Thomas Bradley had experienced in his previous years of service. As a member of the regular guard, he had always been on the periphery of the royal celebrations, catching glimpses through doorways and hearing fragments of music drifting down corridors. Now, as part of the king's personal detail, he found himself at the very center of it all, present at family gatherings, privy to private traditions, witnessing moments of genuine warmth that the public never saw. It surprised him, in a way, how normal the royal family could be behind closed doors. Charles exchanged gentle ribbing with his siblings, teased his nieces and nephews, made corny jokes that drew groans from everyone present. The formal occasions were still formal, of course, but there were other times, morning breakfasts, evening fires, quiet walks in the gardens, when the weight of the crown seemed to lift, if only temporarily. Thomas observed all of this with careful attention, learning the dynamics and relationships that shaped the family. He noted who got along with whom, where tensions lay beneath the surface, what subjects were carefully avoided in conversation. It was intelligence gathering of a sort, though for protection rather than exploitation. A guard who understood the people he protected was a guard who could anticipate problems before they arose. But Thomas also could not help being affected by what he witnessed. He had grown up in a close family himself, and seeing Charles with his loved ones reminded him of what he had lost.